Picture this. You are standing in the muddy streets of 15th century London as a low, angry roar begins to roll toward you. The sound isn't a single noise, but many layered together. Iron chains scraping stone, boots slapping through wet filth, voices raised not in justice, but in excitement. And cutting through it all is the raw sobbing of a woman who already knows that mercy is not coming. The crowd parts, not out of respect, but curiosity. Armed guards force their way through, dragging a woman whose fine clothing has been torn into rags. Mud cakes her hair and face. Blood runs down her temple where someone in the crowd has thrown a stone. She stumbles, nearly falling, and the guards jerk her upright again like an object that refuses to cooperate. This woman is Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester. She has been accused of witchcraft and treason, crimes that carry a special kind of terror when applied to a woman in medieval England. As she is dragged toward the Tower of London, her eyes briefly meet yours. What you see there is not confusion or shock. It is recognition. She understands that this moment is not the punishment. It is the prelude. What waits behind those stone walls will erase everything she once was. Her title, her dignity, her humanity, even her hope. We tend to imagine medieval justice as crude but straightforward. Chains, dungeons, perhaps torture chambers hidden beneath castles. But the truth is far worse. The medieval punishment of imprisoned women was not just about confinement or discipline. It was about systematic psychological destruction, carried out through gender-specific cruelty so severe that even contemporary writers avoided describing it in detail. The suffering began long before a woman ever reached a prison cell, arresting a woman in medieval Europe was designed as public theater. Authorities understood the power of spectacle. An arrest was not merely a legal procedure. It was a warning, a lesson, and a form of entertainment. Women were arrested in the most humiliating circumstances possible. Precisely because humiliation was part of the punishment, guards often arrived at dawn when vulnerability was highest. Women were dragged from their beds without being allowed to dress properly. They were marched through crowded streets half-clothed, while town criers shouted their alleged crimes. The crowd was encouraged to jeer, spit, and throw refuse. Children were taught to participate, learning early what happened to women who stepped outside their assigned roles. This humiliation was not accidental. Medieval legal customs explicitly allowed and often encouraged this treatment. Authorities believed shame was as important as physical suffering. Breaking a woman publicly ensured she would arrive at prison already stripped of identity and resistance. Physical violence during arrest was unrestricted. Guards tore clothing deliberately, pulled hair, and struck women openly. The goal was not efficiency. It was psychological warfare. By the time a woman reached prison gates, she was meant to feel already defeated. Eleanor Cobham's arrest was orchestrated with particular cruelty. As a duchess, she represented female authority and independence. Her public degradation was meant to send a message to every woman watching. Wealth, rank, and proximity to power offered no protection. Guards stripped her of jewelry, destroyed her fine garments, and forced her to walk barefoot through London's filth, while laughing spectators watched her fall again and again. By the time she entered the Tower, the woman who had once commanded servants and influence had been reduced to a trembling figure barely recognizable as human. Once inside, the intake process completed the destruction that the streets had begun. What medieval authorities called examination was, in reality, ritualized humiliation. Women were forced to strip completely under the supervision of male guards. These searches had little to do with security. They were performed publicly in front of guards and prisoners alike, accompanied by mocking commentary and threats. Head shaving followed. Hair was hacked away with dull blades, often cutting the scalp. In medieval culture, a woman's hair symbolized beauty, sexuality, and identity. Removing it was a deliberate act of erasure. Women were meant to look inhuman, stripped of femininity and self-recognition. The clothing they received afterward reinforced this message. Rough sackcloth garments were intentionally ill-fitting, designed to humiliate and restrict movement. These garments also served another purpose. They made women easier to control and easier to violate. Without the need to fully undress them again, perhaps most devastating was the forced gratitude. Women were made to thank their captors for food, water, or simply being allowed to live. This psychological inversion broke resistance by forcing prisoners to acknowledge their abusers as benefactors. By the time intake ended, most women were no longer defiant. They moved cautiously. They avoided eye contact. They obeyed without being told. The transformation was intentional. The prisons themselves were weapons. Medieval prison architecture was designed to crush hope before any formal punishment occurred. The Tower of London was not just a fortress. Its massive walls, deep foundations, and narrow passages were meant to communicate permanence. Once inside, escape felt impossible. Women were housed in the lowest levels, often underground. This placement was deliberate. Being buried beneath stone created associations with death and burial that increased despair. Cells were small enough to prevent comfort but large enough to avoid immediate death. Windows, when they existed, were placed too high to see the outside world. Prisoners could be watched, but never see freedom. Sanitation was deliberately neglected. Women were forced to eat, sleep, and relieve themselves in the same space. This was not oversight. Living in filth was intended to reduce prisoners to animal status in their own minds. Ventilation was minimal. Air grew thick and poisonous. Light was carefully controlled, creating disorientation that destroyed normal sleep cycles. Time itself became meaningless. Sound was another weapon. Prisoners heard screams, chains, and footsteps echoing through stone corridors without knowing their source. This constant uncertainty kept women in a state of fear. Unable to relax even briefly, water was rationed just enough to prevent death. Food arrived unpredictably. Hunger and thirst became tools of control. Temperature fluctuated brutally with the seasons, freezing in winter and suffocating in summer. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and fevers swept through women's quarters regularly. Authorities viewed these deaths as convenient solutions to overcrowding in places like Newgate Prison. Women were packed into underground chambers never meant for human habitation. 15 or more women might share a single cell, sleeping in shifts amid filth and decomposing bodies. New prisoners often fainted upon entry from the toxic air alone. Pregnant women received no mercy. They were shackled more heavily to prevent escape. Births occurred in filth, without medical care. Infants often died quickly. Mothers were forced to remain with the bodies until removal. The legal system offered no protection. Women existed in legal gray zones where testimony was considered unreliable and abuse was assumed to be deserved. Accusations alone were enough to justify imprisonment. Innocence was irrelevant. Crimes for which women were imprisoned often reflected society's obsession with controlling. Female behavior, gossip, adultery, disobedience, or merely existing without male protection could result in confinement. Witchcraft accusations, in particular, targeted women almost exclusively, relying on rumor and forced confession rather than evidence. Punishments outside prison walls reinforced these messages. Stocks, pillories, public floggings, and ducking stools were modified specifically to humiliate women. Clothing was torn. Bodies were exposed. Crowds were encouraged to participate. Children learned through spectacle. Even religious institutions were complicit. Monastery prisons combined isolation with theological justification. Suffering was reframed as spiritual purification. Resistance became sin. Abuse was disguised as discipline. Medical care, when present, served institutional goals rather than healing. Illness was blamed on moral failure. Treatment was withheld unless necessary to preserve a prisoner's ability to work. Economics drove much of this cruelty. Female prisoners generated revenue. Their labor was exploited. Families were charged for basic necessities. Every interaction became a transaction designed to extract wealth. Silence completed the system. Women were told no one would believe them. Records avoided explicit description. Suffering was hidden behind euphemism. What happened to women behind medieval prison walls was not an accident of a brutal age. It was a carefully constructed system designed to control, humiliate, and erase. And it worked not because it was secret, but because it was accepted. History remembers castles, kings, and battles. It rarely remembers the women whose spirits were broken beneath those stones. But their suffering shaped medieval society just as surely as any war. To understand the past honestly, we have to look into those shadows. Not for shock, but for truth.